I was young, I'd flee this town.
Hello everyone. Today our topic is globalization, and we're going to begin by answering a simple question. What is globalization? So, globalization is another one of those terms you hear in everyday language, but that is really hard to pin down specifically enough for scientific study. Indeed, a lot of political scientists and economists and other analysts often disagree exactly how to classify and measure globalization because it is such a broad group of processes. The bottom line is that globalization encompasses a bundle of interconnected changes that basically boil down to the decreasing importance of state boundaries. Things that once stayed inside states, or at least had a hard time moving between states, have now become much more mobile. Globalization means that political, economic, and social phenomena move much more quickly from place to place, and that people, capital, and information are much more mobile. You can think of this as geography just becoming a bit less important. Globalization also means that the world is increasingly interdependent, which means that what happens on one side of the globe affects people on the other side. So things that happen in states that maybe in the past would have only affected people living in that one state, now they can affect people in neighboring states and even around the world. Because globalization involves the interaction between international, geopolitical factors and factors within states, this is an area of study that combines comparative politics and international relations. In recent years, it has become increasingly important for scholars in both fields to work hard to analyze events at the other level of study because of globalization. We can divide globalization into three rough categories. The first is political globalization, which involves greater integration of and cooperation among states. One reason for this is that many important issues are increasingly transnational, and transnational means that they involve multiple states, and they require the cooperation of all of these states working together to have any hope of being solved. Because of these transnational problems, we've seen the development of many international governmental organizations that have real influence on policymaking and the debates over global issues. So first of all, you've got the United Nations pictured here, and other organizations such as the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund. So these are big organizations that operate on a global scale and that actually have real say in policymaking a lot of the time. Regional associations have also become increasingly important, with the European Union being the key example that we'll focus on in a bit. The EU has seen political integration to the point where many of its members now have open borders, a historically unprecedented occurrence for modern sovereign states. If you'll remember back to our discussion of the modern state at the beginning of the term, you'll remember that territoriality, that having boundaries is a really important aspect of it. But the European Union sort of challenges this notion because now you can go between the states. So here you see the border between Germany and Austria, just like going between Ohio and Pennsylvania. Another broad variety of globalization is economic globalization, and this is probably the most common meaning of that general term. Economic globalization involves increased movement of capital, and capital here is money and resources, and investment. With globalization, this capital moves across state boundaries much more rapidly. Firms have become more international, and they do business in many states, so you can buy very similar products all over the world. Globalization is typically equated with neoliberal economic policies, and neoliberal economic policies are those very free trade economic policies. So they emphasize low barriers to trade or tariffs, so you can get things that are produced in other countries without the state putting sort of an extra amount on that price just for importing. All of this means that states' economies have become much more dependent upon one another. So again, that theme of what happens in one state affecting what happens in other states. A closely related process is cultural globalization, which refers to the broad development of cultural symbols that go beyond any one nation or state. Many see this, whether happily or unhappily, as a broad process of westernization in general and of Americanization in particular. Indeed, one critic has called this the phenomenon of McWorld, which is replacing local traditions, cultures, and even languages with a more homogeneous Western or North American culture. The criticism here is that instead of having a lot of diversity, a lot of different perspectives, cultural globalization is basically replacing all of this diversity with sort of a one-size-fit-all commercial American and perhaps European model of culture. There's another side to this, however, as ideas move both ways, and people all over the world have more access to information as well as an increased ability to broadcast themselves and share information with the rest of the world. So it is certainly not the case that cultural globalization only means Westernization or Americanization. because increasingly people from all over the world are becoming connected through social media and the internet, meaning that they too can, as YouTube encourages us all to do, broadcast themselves. So what is causing this broad process of globalization? Why are we hearing so much about globalization in recent years? Well, there really isn't any one cause, as it is a really multifaceted, interconnected process involving lots of different factors. We're going to look at just a few. One key driver of globalization is the increase in technology, which has made great distances seem much smaller. Information technology has enabled the rapid sharing of information, with ideas flowing across the globe via the internet and social media instantaneously. This also means that it is much easier for people to do business all over the world, as you can have an online meeting with an associate on another continent and easily wire them funds over the internet. So these are things that would have just been unthinkable not too long ago. It has also become much easier to travel long distances, with interstate travel via both air and land being cheaper and easier than ever before. Thus, people are able to move between states in a way we've never seen before. Another reason for the increase in globalization has to do with economic ideology and the rise of sort of dominant American power at the end of the Second World War and continuing up to today. Particularly after the Cold War, liberal economies are seen as the best option. So liberal economies, again, being those very free trade, low barriers to exchange between states, those sorts of economies. Developing countries are often encouraged by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to adopt these liberal free market policies and to eradicate trade barriers. American hegemony, or dominance, has increased this trend, as the U.S. has always been a strong advocate of the free market. And finally, though there have certainly been backlashes against many aspects of globalization, there is also a sense that many people, and a lot of really important policymakers, desire this sort of integration, both because they fear a repeat of some of the worst parts of the 20th century, and because they feel that increased international cooperation will be key to meeting the challenges of the 21st century. For instance, the first steps towards European integration and the nascent form of the European Union were really put together primarily by politicians in France and Germany, who, having fought two really devastating wars of unimaginable human suffering in previous decades, looked at European integration as the best way to prevent a repeat of these events. Moreover, today we live in a world in which many problems are simply beyond the scope of any one state, even the biggest states in the world. Transnational problems like terrorism, drug and human trafficking, environmental degradation, and international conflict require coordination and cooperation, and so joint political and economic efforts have become a constant reality today. So here you see examples like drug trafficking, and you can obviously see that this is something that's a global phenomenon. It's not something that one state can really control. One state's actions don't operate in a vacuum when it comes to stopping drug trafficking and other forms of illegal trafficking. The same is true of climate change. What one state does affects every other state in the world pretty much. And so it's an issue that takes, and so it's a transnational issue, an issue that takes a lot of global cooperation. So what are the effects of globalization? Well, this is obviously a huge question with many answers, but we're going to focus on just a couple of broad trends. And the first is contagion. That is, all sorts of economic, political, social, and cultural dynamics now move very easily among states. Because information, money, and people move around a lot more, there are many more opportunities for a given idea, movement, or fashion to spread. The Arab revolts show just how contagious a social movement can be in the age of a 24-hour news cycle and social media. Indeed, globalization's contagion can be quite literal, as a more mobile world population has facilitated a much more rapid spread of disease, which has many world health experts a bit on edge. Finally, because of the world's increasing interconnectedness and interdependence, economic prosperity, as well as economic devastation, can sweep across state boundaries quickly. This was the case with the Asian financial crisis at the end of the 1990s, and of course with the Great Recession, which started in the United States before spreading to virtually every corner of the world. This might also be the case with the Eurozone crisis if EU leaders are unable to prevent what at the time of this recording seems to be a rather steady downward spiral. The next effect we're going to think about is constraint, which is quite closely related to contagion. Think of it this way. Contagion means that whether the leaders of a state like it or not, things in other parts of the world may have profound effects upon their state. In other words, they have less control over what is going on in their states. Thus, globalization puts constraints upon actors within states. It adds boundaries to what they can do in their own domestic politics. This can be cultural, political, or economic. One way to think about this economically is to pay attention to the balance of power between the state and capital. In general, capital, or money, firms, factories, etc., can move, but states are obviously pretty much glued to their location on the map. Globalization increases the mobility of capital, meaning that it's much easier to move your investments, your savings, your jobs, your production of your products to another state. This gives capital a bit of extra power over the state, as the state wants to prevent what's called capital flight from its borders, because that would mean that the state's economy would sink. Indeed, what states really want to do is attract as much capital as possible, but if it is easy to move capital around, states have a lot more competition. So we end up with a situation where Italian farmers are angry about cheap foods flowing in from the US workers are angry about manufacturing jobs being outsourced to cheaper production lines in the developing world, and people in the developing world are angry because their highly educated professionals, such as doctors and engineers, tend to leave for the wealthier societies where they can make more money. This also puts real constraints upon what the state can do. So it may, for example, limit the kinds of social provision or taxation policies states have at their disposal. This is particularly true of the smallest states and markets, who can be extremely vulnerable to global economic fluctuations, though no countries, not even the world's biggest states and economies, are immune. A related question is whether globalization undermines democratic accountability. The term the democratic deficit has become rather popular in recent years. The democratic deficit is a situation in which democratic leaders, who are obviously elected by their state citizens and put in power to follow the will of the people in their state, must often listen to international and market forces instead of their constituents. So, as we were saying, these leaders are often constrained by international organizations or just international trends, meaning that they can't always offer every policy. Thus, the question becomes, who are leaders really accountable to? If voters can't control the international market or their country's major trading partners or the International Monetary Fund, but these forces have a real effect upon political policy in their state, how are they supposed to play a meaningful role? While the democratic deficit is a very real concern, globalization can also have a positive effect on democratization. First, it enables the fast-paced spread of ideals. And one of the main ideals that is spread is the view that democracy is the most legitimate and desirable form of government today. Remember when we were talking about political ideologies and regime types, we learned that pretty much every sort of regime type today at least tries to pretend that it has some sort of democratic legitimacy by having elections, whether or not they're actually free or fair. So this ideal of democracy has really spread. Contagion means that social movements, including movements for democracy, can spread rapidly across state borders, as we saw dramatically with the outbreak of the Arab Revolt in 2011. Finally, because of more pervasive information technology and the growth of international governmental organizations, states are watched much more closely in terms of human rights violation, discrimination, and other illiberal acts. Alright, so that concludes our very brief introduction to globalization. Obviously, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and we're going to return to the specific case of the European Union, which is a really interesting example of globalization and its role on the state in the future. But for now, thank you very much for all of your attention and your hard work.